Your shutter speed is a very important thing to consider when you're shooting video on DSLR cameras. If you've done photography before, you know that shutter speed essentially determines how much motion blur you're going to have in your images. The same concept holds true for video, but there's an added twist that I won't get into until the second half of this tutorial. We're going to start off by showing how to set shutter speed on the Canon T2i. There's a shutter dial on the top right of the camera which you can turn left or right to set your shutter speed. Notice the numbers changing on the bottom left corner of the LCD screen. These numbers represent how many fractions of a second each frame is being exposed for. So for example, a shutter speed of 60 means you're exposing each individual frame of your movie for 1/60th of a second. Notice the fan here is spinning pretty fast. Right now our shutter speed setting says 400, meaning each frame is being exposed for 1/400th of a second. Because we're exposing each frame so briefly, there's minimal motion blur and we can see the fan blade clearly, and we can even make out the writing on the t-shirt. If we slow down our shutter speed, say from 1/400th of a second to 1/30th of a second, the first thing you'll notice is that we need to shrink our aperture, that's the size of our lens opening, in order to compensate for the extra light we're getting with a longer exposed image. We'll discuss aperture more in a later video. For now, notice that we have an image with about the same brightness as our previous sample, but with much more motion blur. Because each frame is being exposed for a longer period of time, more movement is being captured in each individual still frame of the video. If we slow down the footage, you can really see what I mean by this. If we slow it down even further and start advancing our movie frame by frame, you might notice that even though the video on the left has a much faster shutter speed, the fan blades in both videos are covering the same amount of distance between each frame. Well, this is that extra twist I was talking about earlier. A lot of people get confused between a video camera's frame rate and a video camera's shutter speed. Most of these people, and I was once one of them, confuse the shutter speed of the camera for the frame rate and think, well, if I shoot an image at a shutter speed of 1/400th of a second, then that means my camera is capturing 400 images each second, so there should be less jump between each frame. This is wrong. The frame rate of your camera does not change with shutter speed. That's why both fan blades appear to skip the same amount of space between each individual frame. The frame rate of your camera has to be set manually by pressing the Q button and navigating to the second last option. You can see the Canon T2i really has 3 frame rates available: 24, 30, and 60. Note that 60 frames per second is only available in 1280 by 720 resolution. The important point to remember here is that these frame rates remain 24, 30, and 60 frames per second regardless of your shutter speed settings. What does change with shutter speed is the exposure time of each of the 30, 24, or 60 frames that are being taken each second. Let's demonstrate what 1 second of video recording might look like if you were shooting at 30 frames per second and if your camera was exposing each frame for 1/30th, 1/60th, or 1/90th of a second. The white square will represent how long the shutter stays open for per each of the 30 frames. You can see that in each frame, the shutter speed determines the amount of time that each frame is exposed for. The bottom shutter speed is exposing the light sensor for 1/3 of a frame, and so it's a 1/90th of a second exposure. The middle setting holds the shutter open for half the length of an individual frame and is a 1/60th of a second exposure. The top setting is opening the shutter for the entire duration of the frame, and so it's a 1/30th of a second exposure. Notice that regardless of how fast the shutter speed is, they're all getting 30 frames per second. When we shoot with a shutter speed of 1/400th of a second, our camera is still taking 30 frames each second, but it's taking the 30 frames that it captures each second and exposing each individual frame for 1/400th of a second. In this case, the camera exposes one frame for 1/400th of a second, then waits for the next frame and exposes a new image for 1/400th of a second again. The result is a crisper looking frame, but not more frames per second. If there were more frames per second, the fan wouldn't appear to jump forward in each frame, but would have a seamless flow of images like this shot of an owl taken with a special slow motion camera that shoots 1,000 frames every second instead of 30. In the case of our second fan shot, each of the 30 frames captured every second is being exposed for a full 1/30th of a second, and that's what causes the motion blur in each individual frame. So, frame rates are set and determine how many images are taken each second, and shutter speed determines the length of exposure for each of those individual frames. When shooting on the T2i or other DSLR cameras with video capability, a tried rule of thumb is to aim for a shutter speed that is double the amount, or as close as possible to double the amount, of your frame rate. So that means if you're set at 30 frames per second, then shooting with a shutter speed of 60 will give you the best results, especially if your shot has a lot of camera movement.